Awesome. Well,
Oh, sorry, starting the recording.
got it. Well, thank you, John, for that nice introduction. And thank you to those of you who are with us this evening. Feel free to unmute your, show your screen if your camera, if you'd like, but if you're eating dinner, I don't want to interrupt you. But yes, I'm so excited to be here. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. Do feel free to put your comments in the chat, and I'll stop about 2/3 of the way through to answer any questions or anything as we sort of transition into another part of the presentation. But I just love this picture here before you here. It's kind of a really cool visual of how our lakes change, what our lakes look like through the different seasons. I did not do this photo. I stole it from someone. Don't tell anyone. I think it's actually Lake George in New York, but I thought it could pass for a New Hampshire lake. All right, so here we go. How many lakes and ponds are there in New Hampshire? And if you want to type it into the chat, you're welcome to. But again, if you're eating dinner, no worries. John, let's see here. All right. There are approximately 1,000 lakes and ponds in New Hampshire. So I say there's something for everyone when it comes to our lakes and ponds. There really is something for everyone when it comes to our lakes and ponds all year round. And I just wanted to start off the presentation with just go through a little bit of a slideshow, just go through some of the things we love about our lakes and how we enjoy them. And if I've missed an activity that you love, feel free to type it into the chat. But something for nearly everyone when it comes to our lakes and ponds all year long. Motorboating. Let's see here. Ice fishing. I just love this picture of this happy family. That might have been a couple of months ago. There's Nordic skating. This is pretty cool and great exercise. This is a pond hockey tournament. If you guys have never seen this, this is on Meredith Bay on Lake Winnipesaukee, and just a huge, wonderful, fun activity. Also a really good economic stimulus to the Meredith region during the winter. Snowmobiling. There's lots of snowmobiling that happens on our lakes during the winter, and even some ice harvesting. This is kind of traditional, but the Rocky Wall Deep Haven camps on Squam Lakes harvest ice every winter. And for those of you who have followed history, way back when, 100 years ago, ice harvesting was a big deal in New Hampshire's lakes, and ice was actually from New Hampshire's lakes shipped all around the world. Pretty crazy, but just another neat way we use and enjoy our lakes. Ice sailing. This is a picture I took on Lake Sunapee a number of years ago. And yes, on the big lake, Lake Winnipesaukee in Alton, we have the only FAA approved ice landing in the lower 48 states. So another really unique use of our lakes. And dog sledding, again, very unique. And then, so I sometimes feel like there's more to do on our lakes during the winter, actually, than during the rest of the year. But then as we transition from winter to spring, we have that period, the period right now where our lakes aren't really that usable. We do have some brave souls out there, probably kayaking around, breaking up the ice here and there. I hope they're being careful. But then as we transition into spring, this is a picture I took a number of years ago with my best friends on Newfound Lake. So, paddling, there's so much, you can paddle to your heart's content here on our lakes. Sailing, Hobie Cat. My husband and I have gone through a number of Hobie Cats on New Hampshire's lakes. And for those of you in the group that are sailors, our lakes can be tricky to catch wind sometimes. Again, kayaking. So much fun. Water skiing, that seems to be a rite of passage in New Hampshire, learning to water ski. It's just one of the things, if you live on a lake, something you learn to do. Tubing, this is actually me and my daughter a long time ago, but again, another really fun activity on our lakes. And wake surfing, this is a fun activity growing in popularity. Maybe for those of you are familiar with the sport, sometimes it causes a little bit of controversy, and we won't go there tonight, but we do know that This is another fun, family-friendly activity that, if done in the right way on our lakes, can coexist with other uses. And fishing, that's another fun thing we can do on our lakes in summer. Well, spring, fall, and summer. And of course, swimming, jumping off the docks. It's probably a little too cold to do that right now. But these kids look like they're having the time of their life. And of course, fall, fall, I think is one of my favorite times to go paddling. It's just so beautiful, or rowing. So there's a lot of, throughout the year, there's so many ways we can enjoy our lakes through the seasons. And again, if I didn't hit on a activity that you love, feel free to put it in the chat. But really, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. And it's why you are all here today. Lakes and ponds are an integral part of New Hampshire's quality of life. It's why we, why we live here, and why a lot of us, have moved here, is to enjoy the outdoors, and lakes and ponds are a big part of that. Lakes and ponds are, have been important to our heritage for so long. At the turn of the century, the last turn of the 1900s, and there were, big hotels along our shores, and people would, take the train up from Boston and stay for the summer. And so we have a wonderful, rich history of grand hotels and steamboats and antique boats. Really, really part of our heritage. So just a brief, introduction that, our lakes really are ingrained, in our society, and I'm assuming in your lives. Again, that's why you're here tonight. So John had invited me to give a presentation this evening, more along the aquatic biologist from, talking to you about how our lakes actually change throughout the seasons, how the physics of our lakes change, and so I'm going to go through that. And for some of you, this is probably a review, but I hope you'll learn a few new things. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. And then also at the end of this section, I'll open it up for any questions too. So, ever wondered how and why our lakes change with the seasons? It's pretty fascinating. I think it's pretty fascinating. I hope you do as well. So again, that opening slide, we have, our lakes are very distinct as the seasons progress. Really what we're talking about is, as the seasons change, how the water moves in our lakes changes with the seasons. So this is just a preview of what we'll talk about coming up. But yes, it's all about how energy and wind and, dynamics of thermodynamics. I know that sounds really scary, but we'll just boil it down into sort of a lake dynamics 101 here. And I find that it's easiest to talk about the cycle. It's an annual cycle, right? I find that it's easiest to start at the summer, and talk about the cycle from summer to the end of spring. So during the summer, our deeper lakes basically over time divide into different layers based on temperature. So, think about June, probably May, April, May, our lakes are pretty much the same temperature from top to bottom. And you'll learn a little bit more about that when we talk a little later. But, right now our lakes are pretty much a uniform temperature from top to bottom. But as the sun, shines and warms up that top of the lake is slowly going to warm up, and that temperature, that energy is going to start to sink down into the lake. And our deeper lakes, so, Great East Lake, Lake Winnipesaukee, Squam, those lakes are going to basically develop these thermal layers, these different layers based on temperature. So the picture to the right is sort of, the very textbook picture of the different layers of the lake. You may have heard epilimnion, that's the top layer, the warm, less dense layer. The hypolimnion, that's at the bottom. It's the dense, cold layer. And then the middle between that warm upper layer and that cold, dense lower layer is the thermocline. And that is just a fancy word for area where the temperature changes really quickly. The density and the temperature changes. But, and I should also say our smaller lakes may weakly stratify or divide into 3 layers, or may even have more like 2 layers of based on temperature and density. And some of our smallest ponds, so when I say that, like ponds 20 feet, water bodies 20 feet or less, usually don't develop these layers. They just become the same temperature from the top to the bottom. But generally speaking, our deeper lakes are going to have these 3 different layers. And as summer goes on, the layering gets more strong, with more energy from the sun added. That warm top layer moves down. But the bottom layer of the lake really gets sealed off from the atmosphere. So whatever, oxygen and nutrients you had at the bottom of the lake at the beginning of the summer, you're not going to get any more oxygen into the lake bottom because it's basically sealed off from the atmosphere. It would take a lot of energy for the oxygen to get mixed through those different layers, because again, each of those layers, as you go down from the top to the bottom, has increasing density. So it's harder and harder to mix it up. So as the summer goes on, the thermocline in our deeper lakes gets deeper and further down. And I just like to throw in some tidbits here and there. If you fish, the anglers like to find the cline. They like to know where's that layer of rapidly changing temperature and density. And the reason for that is that that's where the fish generally like to hang out, because that's where, if you have any food and nutrients falling down, they're going to get stuck in that thermocline again, because it's really hard to break that barrier to get into the hypolimnion, that really dense lower layer. I have to say, and John said, I used to work with the Department of Environmental Services. So every day in the summer, I used to be on a different lake doing water quality sampling. And, often, I would do temperature profiles. Often fishermen, anglers would yell out to me, "Hey, where's the thermocline today?" So that's a real thing. If you're into angling, you know that's going to help you find the fish. As summer goes on, in our deeper lakes in particular, that barrier between, again, the surface and the bottom is very defined, and again, very hard to break. And so any oxygen you have in the bottom of the lake, you're not going to get more oxygen being mixed in from the atmosphere. Any oxygen that's at the bottom of the lake starts to get used up. It gets used up by decomposition, so things being broken down. And nutrients often build up. There's also this really cool chemical thing that happens. It's actually bad, but it's interesting. When the sediment becomes anoxic, which means when the sediment has no oxygen, this chemical reaction happens that any nutrients, any phosphorus that's in the sediment actually gets released. A chemical bond gets broken. And I shouldn't assume we all know what phosphorus is. Phosphorus is a nutrient that's essential to life, but too much phosphorus in a lake means too much nutrients, and too much, it can spur plant and algae growth. So phosphorus is a vital nutrient, but we don't want too much phosphorus in our lakes. So any additional phosphorus in our lakes over natural amounts will contribute to excessive algae and plant blooms. Plant growth. So again, after a long summer and a long period of stratification with those different layers, again, in our bigger lakes, you will see, and I've seen this by going out and water sampling and taking measurements, the amount of nutrients, the amount of oxygen in the bottom goes down, and the amount of nutrients goes up in the bottom. So put a pin in that, because we'll be talking about that internal phosphorus loading in just a minute or two. Our lakes typically reach their maximum temperature in mid-July. This is a friend out on Crystal Lake in Enfield. Sometimes our lakes get upwards of 80 degrees at the top of the lake, so bath water. But from July, mid-July, they really start cooling off. This is when I will transition from summer into autumn. Beautiful photo here. So lakes in autumn. So in autumn, lakes really experience a rejuvenation. So lakes, since the mid to end part of July, they're starting to lose energy. They're losing heat. They're cooling off. And as the lakes cool off, if there's any of that stratification, that layering based on density and temperature, that layering is going to start to break down. So in the fall, then usually the wind starts picking up and starts mixing the lake and breaking up those layers. And this is called turnover, fall turnover. And what happens with turnover is it really is a rejuvenation. It's bringing oxygen back into the lake. Again, towards the end of the summer, the oxygen at the bottom probably got depleted. So it's bringing in fresh new oxygen. And that's really important. Again, the oxygen's important for all the critters in the lake. It's important for a lot of reasons. But then, the lake keeps cooling. And by the end of fall, the lake is going to be basically the same temperature from top to bottom and the same amount of oxygen from top to bottom. But remember when I said, put a pin on it with all that that internal phosphorus loading at the bottom of the lake in the summer? Let's see here. Fall mixing, while it's a good thing, sometimes in our deeper lakes, if you have that buildup of nutrients at the bottom of the lake towards the end of the summer, when the lake mixes in the fall, it's going to all of a sudden mix all that nutrients, all that phosphorus up into the water column, which may fuel algae and, more concerningly, toxic cyanobacteria blooms. For those of you on the call that aren't familiar with cyanobacteria, yay, that's a good thing. That means your lake hasn't had a toxic cyanobacteria bloom. But this is a bacteria that acts and looks like an algae, but it's actually can be toxic to you, to wildlife, to your pets. And unfortunately, we are seeing an increasing amount of cyanobacteria blooms in our lakes throughout the whole throughout the whole season, spring through fall. But we're also seeing a marked increase in the number of cyanobacteria that are happening in cyanobacteria blooms that are happening in late fall. We actually had one lake this fall that was still blooming with cyanobacteria until late November. So that's, that lake mixed up, and then those nutrients just kept fueling this toxic bloom. So that's concerning. Internal loading is something that's a whole other, webinar, John, we can have sometime. What really is internal loading and how do we manage it? But, for the purposes of tonight, let's say we want to avoid internal loading. So. All right, so in late fall, early winter, as the surface of our lake starts to cool and cool below 39 degrees Fahrenheit, something rather unusual, and if you're in biology nerd like me, something really cool happens. The water molecules at the surface of the lake actually expand and crystallize into, this interlocking lattice of ice. And so the reason why this is so unusual is in nature, as things get colder, they get, typically the laws of nature is something gets colder, it gets more dense. However, water is really unique. As it cools from, say, summertime of 80 degrees to, late fall, early winter, the water cools down and starts cooling down from 80 down to 39, it's getting more and more dense. But at 39 degrees, again, this amazing thing happens where water actually becomes less dense, and these molecules form and this crystalline pattern forms, and it becomes less dense. Well, actually, let's rewind a little bit. So when the water cools to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, actually, that's when water's at its most dense, and that 39 degree water falls to the bottom of the lake and pushes warmer, less dense water up top to the lake. And so this process, so then the water comes up from the bottom and starts cooling, and this happens successively. So what ends up happening is the 39 degree water becomes dense, falls down, pushes warmer water up. That water cools and becomes more dense and falls down and pushes warmer water up. And when the whole lake gets to maximum density of water, which is 4 degrees Celsius or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, then the top of the lake starts to freeze and become, again, at 32 degrees is when then the crystals form. So that wasn't a great explanation. I apologize. But this is the whole reason why lakes don't freeze from the bottom up, and why ice in your glass floats at the top. So ice is less dense than the water underneath it. So, and yeah, so that's a really unique feature of our lakes. So as the air temperature in winter continues to cool, the ice becomes thicker, the cold air transfers through the lake and starts freezing the water below the ice. It's not uncommon in New Hampshire to have on our bigger lakes, 2 feet of ice. I think this year, relatively speaking, it was a shorter ice season, but we still did get upwards of 2 feet of ice on a lot of our bigger lakes. Our lakes are really unique. They're really cool. Not all lakes in the US freeze. My mother-in-law, just a short story, they live on Seneca Lake in New York. So the biggest finger lake up in New York. And, that lake has only frozen, I think, has skimmed over maybe 2 times in the past century. And so when they come to visit, we take them out on the frozen lakes, and my mother-in-law is, walking out in the lake and like, this isn't right. Lakes aren't supposed to freeze. But I think we're really lucky here, and it's really unique. And as I said, I really do think there's more to do on our lakes in the winter than there's any other time of year, but I guess it just depends on your perspective. So during winter, our lakes are sealed off from the atmosphere. So, most, if not all of our lakes do form a skim of ice. And then again, in some areas becomes upwards of a couple feet thick. But what happens is any oxygen, any nutrients you had in that lake, at the end of fall, as the freezing started, that's the oxygen and the nutrients you're going to have in the lake, until it melts again in the spring. So same sort of idea during the summer. Again, we talked about those layerings. So during the winter, the oxygen in the lake will get used up as all those animals that are in the lake are using it. Granted, during the winter, our animals in our lakes start to slow down. They don't move as much. Fish generally go to the bottom of the lake and exert as little bit of motion as possible, so they're not expending too much energy and not using up too much oxygen. And also, any algae, plants, whatever that's fallen to the bottom of the lake, from the last growing season, from the last summer, is being decayed, and those decomposer organisms use up oxygen too. So, you're seeing a theme here now of density and oxygen and temperature. It's really driving, what is happening in our lakes during these seasons. So what happens under the ice? I couldn't help but show this silly picture. So we already kind of talked about this. Most of the animals in the lake are in a state of hibernation. They're seeking protection and burrowing down into the lake bottom sediment. And I always like throwing this picture of this snapping turtle up on the right. I found this picture. It's this snapping turtle out on top of the ice, and it's a very bizarre picture. This guy shouldn't be up there on top of the ice. He is somewhere down in the lake, buried in the mud and not moving at all, but just hanging out, waiting for warmer, more oxygenated water. During the winter, the plants die back and they're no longer producing oxygen. So again, that theme about oxygen on our lakes during the summer, spring, summer, during fall, during the growing season, plants are another. Not only does oxygen get mixed into the lake from the wind, a lot of oxygen in our lakes comes from plants and algae producing the oxygen. So during the winter, they're no longer able to make oxygen. They're no longer able to do photosynthesis. If you think back to a 7th grade biology class, that process of, making oxygen using the sun's energy, and also making food for them to grow. So they're really just kind of hanging out and dying, but their roots are staying, in the bottom and just, saving up, sucking up any energy they can and waiting to grow again. So, I'm trying to paint a picture of, again, as the winter goes on, in our lakes, the oxygen is decreasing. For some smaller bodies of water that had less oxygen to begin with, once the ice came, if we have a long period of ice cover, there may be some areas of the lake where the oxygen gets completely used up. And unfortunately, sometimes this causes fish kills. This is not a picture from New Hampshire. And if you're eating dinner, I apologize and let me get off this slide. But yeah, so again, just that, there's I hope you're, starting to appreciate there's this delicate balance between temperature and oxygen and density. So in mid-March, so just a couple weeks ago, the ice begins to go out on our lakes. And as of today, ice out has been called on most of our lakes, although I did talk to some folks up in the North Country and it's not quite out on some of those lakes up there, which is amazing to think about. But yeah, so the ice is melting. Ice out was declared on the Big Lake on Lake Winnipesaukee last Friday at exactly 5:20 p.m. Which is pretty similar to when it was called last year. But what exactly is ice out though? And this is, we could do, John, an article or a presentation just on the different ways people determine ice out and the history of ice in and ice out dates. But I just thought this picture of this kid was kind of amusing. Ice out typically is described when ice leaves a lake in the spring. However, there's not a universal scientific definition of that. Some consider ice out to be when a boat can navigate from one end of the lake to another. Some say it's when there's absolutely, no more ice in the lake whatsoever. So it's kind of fun to see, what the different communities consider ice out. Ice out on Lake Winnipesaukee is declared when the MS Mount Washington, the tour boat, can navigate between its ports in Alton Bay, Center Harbor, Weirs Beach, Meredith, and Wolfboro. So that was, again, ice out was determined there last Friday. And basically this is determined by someone flying over the lake and then doing a visual inspection of where that boat would have to navigate. They don't actually take the boat in there and try to do it, but they do have someone fly over and do it, take a look at the route. So ice out is a really exciting time of year. And if you're logged in this call, I probably don't have to tell you that. For many, it's the traditional start of the spring season. And when many people, islanders, my family has a place on an island on Sunapee. It's when they can start accessing their cottage or their home. But it's usually, we say it's the start of the spring season. And it's also, side note, kind of amazing to me how the timing of ice out is really pretty similar. I know, at least on our bigger lakes. So, ice out again, Winnipesaukee last Friday, Squam ice out was the day before. Winnisquam, Newfound, I think had also last Friday or Saturday. So all within a couple of days of each other. I do also know typically the ice goes out in southern New Hampshire where we have smaller, more shallow ponds, usually 2.5 weeks sooner. We have a board member who has already lives down on a lake right on the border with Massachusetts, and he and his family have already been out water skiing. So crazy. But so how does the ice actually go out? Ice out is really the reverse of ice in. So we talked about how ice in happens when the lake loses heat in the fall. Ice out happens when the lake starts gaining heat in the spring. And of course, we're getting that heat from the sun, and that heat's getting mixed into the lake with the wind. So typically, this is a picture I took a number of years ago on Lake Massasauga in Bradford. It was a February morning on my way to work. Typically during January and February, snow reflects sunlight off the lake. So, that white surface, the snow is reflecting sunlight and the snow is insulating the lake. So, during, deep winter, January and February, our lakes are insulated. The lake is neither gaining or losing heat at that point. And actually, kind of interesting, the bottom sediment of the lake. So the bottom of the lake is usually a little bit warmer, and is maybe radiating a little bit of heat from the bottom. But then around March, the air warms, the angle of the sun, intensifies. The snow on top of the ice starts to melt, and that starts, creates this more translucent surface of the lake, and that starts to allow light to penetrate through the ice. And the ice at this point is acting like a greenhouse. As the sun is shining on it and letting some of the sunlight and energy through, it's heating up the water, but it's also then holding that heat in the lake. So it's, again, sort of think about a greenhouse and how a greenhouse works. It's allowing heat to come in and then it's trapping that heat. And the ice, we talked about the ice melting sort of from the top down. Now the ice is starting to melt from the bottom up as the water right under the bottom of the ice becomes warmer with that sunlight coming through. That water slowly starts to melt the ice. And this is actually my favorite time to be on a lake. When the ice thickness erodes to, up to 12 inches, generally it's 4 to 12 inches, it transforms into this really cool, beautiful structure, I think, long vertical crystals called candles. So people often call this candled ice or honeycombed ice. So there are these long, because of the freezing and thawing, they become these long cylindrical tubes, essentially candles. And then the ice, after, as the candles sort of progress, the ice starts looking black because the candles are transmitting sunlight into the lake. They're allowing that sunlight to penetrate into the lake instead of reflecting it. So it's sort of like the sunlight is being directed into the lake instead of bouncing off and reflected. And it's, again, allowing that sunlight and energy to come in, and that's warming the lake. And so continuing to erode and melt those candles. So if you've ever been, you have to be careful when you do this. You have to be prepared for cold water, but it's super fun to go canoeing or kayaking in the candled ice. And it makes some amazing sounds, and it's just beautiful. The crystals sort of chime, make these crinkling noises, and it's really neat. As the sun continues to heat the ice, the water below continues to warm and then the melt water basically starts sort of erupting out between the ice crystals and breaking them apart, and the wind and waves then continue to break them apart. So it's really an interesting and beautiful time of year, I think. And then the wind inevitably picks up in spring, and it's going to really, really break that ice sheet apart. And the crystals will often be blown to one side of the lake, mounding onto the shoreline and making this, tink, tink crystal-like shattering noise as they pile up against each other and onto the shore. But how fast that ice finally goes out really does depend on how sunny and windy the conditions are. And again, just showing you that ice out on Sunapee was a couple days earlier than Newfound this year. But again, it just depends on the conditions, wind and sun. So if you do live on a lake or live near a lake or have a lake in your community, please report ice out. Please report the date that you think the ice went out. The Department of Environmental Services, our partners there, want people to tell them when the ice goes out in their community. And there's a form on their website. You can fill it out. And what they're doing is compiling a database of ice in and ice out dates some lakes have, like Winnipesaukee has, a lot of data. Others lakes don't have a lot of data. So if you do know the date, please do let them know. And again, we talked about what is the definition of ice out. You can just do your best to tell them what date you thought ice out was. But they're recording this data because it's it's going to help them to understand climate, our changing climate, and, is the period of ice. We've been finding that the period of ice over the past 100 years, period of ice cover the past 100 years has been decreasing, becoming shorter. So ice in the fall is generally occurring later, and ice out is generally occurring earlier in the spring. While ice out on our lakes was about the same time this year as it was last year, I went and looked at some of the data. And even if you look, 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, on average, it looks like ice the past couple of years has been going out about a week before 10 to 15 years ago. So we're definitely, and it's been confirmed by other scientific studies, we are seeing a shorter period of ice cover in the United States, and also in particularly in the Northeast. And that's actually not great news. If you don't love winter, great news, right? But if you're a lake, or you're a lake biologist or a lake lover, that's not good. A shorter period of ice cover means a longer growing season for plants, right? So the water's going to be warmer, sunlight's going to be able to get into the lake, and a longer growing season for plants. That also means invasive plants. So the plants we don't want in there, the milfoils, the fanworts, a longer growing season for algae. We want some algae, but too much algae is not good. A longer growing season for toxic cyanobacteria. Toxic cyanobacteria in particular really is pretty hardy. And again, I said it was blooming in some of our lakes until November last year. So that's no good. A shorter ice cover is concerning. A shorter period of ice cover, thinner ice, less solid ice. These are all problematic for on ice activities during the winter. And again, I sound like a broken record here, but our frozen lakes offer so much recreation and also bring in a lot of tourism revenue to local economies and the state economies. So a shorter period of ice during the winter is going to have ramifications, not only on our enjoyment, but on the economy and on jobs, all sorts of things. But there is some good news about ice going out. And I think one of those good pieces of news is ice out means the loons are in. And if you have been around a lake, it's pretty amazing that the loons seem to know right when to come back. It's like the same day, the same afternoon that the ice breaks up. They're just, they know what's going on. They're very in tune to the ice. If you have seen loons, at least a couple of weeks ago, the Loon Preservation Committee wanted people to let them know that they're starting to see loons coming back. And if you're on social media, I just love watching Facebook, because all of a sudden in the past 2 weeks, you're seeing people posting, oh, the loons are back at my lake. So they are back. They're definitely back in New Hampshire. So that's great news. So finishing out our sort of discussion on what happens in each of the seasons. So lakes in spring. So the wind is now, we're free from ice. The wind is starting to mix up the lake again. And in spring, lakes experience another period of rejuvenation. So, oxygen and nutrients are getting fully mixed in throughout that whole water body. Again, we talked about during the winter, you're going to have a reduction in oxygen, particularly near the bottom. In the spring, we set this, kind of get rejuvenated again, and the temperature and the oxygen and the nutrients are going to be the same, after a couple of weeks of mixing. And then that sets the stage, as we talked about, for what starts to happen, in May and June and July, as the lake starts to warm up and form those different layers based on temperature and energy and density. So in the spring, so where we are now, snowmelt and spring rains wash important nutrients into the lake that help plants and algae grow. Lakes need nutrients. It's just, hopefully they're not washed, we're not getting too many nutrients washed into our lakes. So I know that's something that John and his team and our team and all of you are, if you see something like this happening, this is a big sediment plume in spring, let someone know that there's a problem there. There's a project or a piece of property upstream or a eroding stream bank that's spring rains are washing, soil into the water, and that soil, first of all, makes the water turbid, so not clear, and that's a problem for, fish. The soil particles get into their gills, but also it brings in phosphorus, that nutrient that we're talking about. That while we need phosphorus, too much phosphorus causes excessive plant growth and algae growth and cyanobacteria growth. So we don't want to see that. So again, the spring rains, important nutrients get washed into the lake, but we hope this isn't happening. And the sun's intensity is increasing, slowly warming up our lakes. In a few months, you'll be able to take that first dip, or if you're like our board member, after they went skiing 2 weeks ago, water skiing, they also jumped into the lake. But for most of us, it'll be a few months at least before we take that first dip. But until then, if you do venture out on the lake, we just ask that you be careful, be prepared for cold water. It's a wonderful time, a quiet time to explore the lake, but you need to be smart and be safe about the cold water. So that, in a nutshell, is how our lakes are changing throughout the seasons. And I wanted to put all the diagrams up here together and take a quick pause and open up. John, if you have any questions, or if any of the audience has any questions. See here.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. We had a couple comments, but no one's had questions yet. I did come up with a couple to run by you.
All right.
That we can go over. And if anyone has questions in the meantime, just feel free to put them in the chat as follow-ups. But
sure.
I was curious in talking about, I think the turnover is really fascinating. And I think a lot of folks, there's a lot of variety and depth in the lakes in the Acton Wakefield region. So like Great East Lake is, I think, over 100 feet deep, and Province Lake is, I think, 15 or 20 feet deep at the deepest point.
Yeah,
so
that's a huge variety.
Yeah, so I'm curious, and I think a lot of folks are curious, like, do shallow lakes have any type of mixing at all, or are they the same temperature all year? And like approximately what depth, or do you know, like, is there like a hard and fast number on what depth you need to have turnover, or is it more latitude based or ecosystem based, or what's the story with that?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I can, kind of give my answer based on what I've seen, in my sampling life. But yes, I would say, so our shallower lakes, I would say, lakes that are 20-ish feet deep, 20 feet deep, you're going to expect during the summer that they're going to basically be the same temperature from the top to the bottom, and they will be freely mixing throughout the summer. Generally, when then you start getting more than 20 feet, and again, I don't know exactly what the cutoffs are, but I feel like 20 to 50 feet, generally speaking, you might get 2 layers of, that really warm layer under a cooler layer. But, a really big windstorm or big rainstorm could mix that up. If a lot of energy came, it could mix up that weak stratification. But in my experience has shown that once you get over 50 feet, you're going to expect, the 3 different layers, and the deeper the lake, the more strong those layers are going to be. So,
okay. So even in shallow lakes, there's still like the nutrient turnover still occurs in the off season.
Yeah, in all of even our shallow lakes during the winter, you're going to get some nutrient buildup at the bottom of the lake, because as things fall down and get decomposed, those nutrients will get released, and then as that lake gets mixed during the spring, those will get sort of redistributed. So yeah, great question. Yeah.
And then kind of a follow-up to that one for me was, so you mentioned like the shorter ice seasons, the shorter winter seasons, sort of from like changing weather patterns and climate change, longer or warmer weather. Does that prevent turnover from occurring in our lakes, or like, I guess, do lakes in the south not have turnover? And so are we, like, is that sort of a byproduct of, like, are we lucky that we get that? And is that something that's at risk, like that nutrient turnover from the impacts of climate change? Or, I mean, it might be a big question, but
No, you're onto something, and that is being studied by climate scientists. I will say I did go to undergrad and grad school in the South and did lake sampling down there, and yeah, their lakes are mixing, throughout the year, and they may
Okay.
mix several times. But climate change, because one of the things with shorter ice period and generally warmer waters is we're getting stratification. Scientists are looking and thinking that stratification is happening sooner, in our lakes, so sooner in the summer, and it's becoming stronger because there's just more energy being put in there, and that may have some ramifications on water quality. So a longer period of stratification is going to lead to more oxygen depletion, on the lake bottom, and then when that and then more nutrient buildup. And then when that lake turns over, we may expect more severe and more frequent cyanobacteria blooms. So you are definitely onto something, and the experts are researching that.
Very, very interesting. So yeah, we had a couple comments. Someone was commenting that it's pretty amazing that the bottom of the lake is 4 degrees Celsius all year. That's pretty cool. I didn't actually know that before this.
Yeah, it is amazing to think that the bottom would actually be radiating. I mean, it's a teeny amount of heat, but it makes it makes a difference. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We did have a question that's semi-related, I think, just because of the ice conversation. Steve asked how large dock bubblers affect the lake. So I guess maybe you could touch on, in your experience, like, are bubblers permittable, allowed? Like, do they have a negative impact on the ecosystem on the shorelines? If you know anything
Yep.
about that,
Yep.
definitely
Great
elaborate.
question. Yeah, great question, Steve. Yeah, I see. Yeah, so people that have permanent docks, this is often on our bigger lakes, but not always. Often people choose to put in, a bubbler or an agitator or circulator or an aquatherm. It has a lot of different names, but basically the technology is all the same. It's inducing bubbles, air bubbles into the water to create turbulence, so that ice cannot form. And so we'll talk about it. You don't have to get a permit for a bubbler, but you do need to register your bubbler with your town. So your town clerk, and there's a small fee. I think it's like, I don't know, like $5 or something. It's really small. But there was some recent legislation passed that you do need to put up appropriate signage. And I believe it's a danger thin ice sign, 3 of them, so that it's visible from all points on the lake. And it needs to be a certain size and a certain color. Because of course, if you're doing a bubbler to detach your structure from the ice sheet, you're weakening the ice, and that may be a safety hazard to someone that's on the lake during winter. The other thing is the recent law that was passed said that you cannot make open water that extends beyond your property lines, like, extended out into the lake. So you can't just throw in an agitator or bubbler, turn it on full bore, for 3 months and leave, because then it's going to, make a huge swath of open water that's going to extend beyond your property, become a big safety hazard. And now going to ecology, and this is something that we New Hampshire Lakes talk about in our lake friendly living program, is that you want a lake friendly living practice is to put your bubbler on a timer and a thermostat so that it's only making open water for the area you really need, just to disconnect your structure from the ice. And the reason being is that, our lakes really do benefit from a period of, from the winter. And by opening up large swaths of water unnaturally, we're allowing more sunlight to get in. We're allowing more algae growth. We're allowing the water to be warmer. And that, as we've just talked about, has a whole host of ramifications. So great question. Thank you for that question.
Cool. Thank you. Cool. A couple more comments. I did have one more question I wanted to touch on, because I thought that was crazy seeing that turtle up on the ice. I have heard that, I know that, like you mentioned, animals slow down, but like life still goes on under the ice, which is really cool. I feel like I have like some like mythical memory from my childhood of fish freezing in the ice. Like, do any animals actually just completely freeze for the winter, or are they all just sort of like chilling at the bottom, hiding in the mud and waiting? Do you know
That is
anything
another
about
great
that?
question. So there's this term, it's called brumulation, B-R-U, I'm going to spell it wrong, but it's brumulation, but it's basically like freezing. It's like they're still active, but it's so low you can't even tell. So yeah, I think people have said, oh, the frogs just freeze in the mud and then they rejuvenate. There is still some metabolic activity going on, but at first glance, you would not be able to tell it. So and in our amphibians and in our fish, their blood characteristics it do change somewhat as the cold winter comes on to allow them to not freeze solid like an ice cube. So
Cool.
great question.
They're more like cryogenically frozen.
Right. Exactly.
Cool.
All right.
Well, yeah, thanks for elaborating on those questions a little bit. Those were all there's a couple, thank yous and cool and comments in the chat, but that was it for questions. So
okay.
If anyone has any last minute questions, please feel free to put them in.
Yeah, well, now I thought I would transition into sort of the second half. John had said that I would provide some tips about taking care of your lake during the different seasons. So we'll do a quick transition into that. I just want to be cognizant of everyone's time here. How are we doing on time?
7 o'clock. So
okay.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have another we have an hour and a half total. So we have another 20 or 30 minutes if there's more to go over.
All right. Well, everyone can grab dessert and we'll talk about a few tips here. So spring really is a great time to, commit to helping keep the lakes you love, you live near, clean and healthy, or recommit. And I mentioned briefly, we have New Hampshire Lakes offers a Lake Smart, Lake Friendly Living program. I know AWA offers lots of help in that area as well, hands-on help in lake friendly living. But why do we need to commit to taking care of our lakes? And we always say it would be pretty crazy for us to think that lakes are just going to take care of themselves. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, so this is when I ask you to take something that you've learned in the next 15 minutes and share it with someone who wasn't here tonight and should be here tonight, or share it with someone who, might live near you on the lake, but has no idea about these simple things that we can do to care for our lake and why we should care for our lake. But just a quick plug for who we are, who New Hampshire Lakes is. And I know some of you familiar faces here, familiar names, are aware of us, but New Hampshire Lakes, we're a statewide nonprofit organization. We serve to be the voice for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. Of course, we work collaboratively with local groups, including John and his team at AWA. Our mission is really, at the end of the day, it's to help keep New Hampshire's lakes clean and healthy now and in the future. And yes, this is my kiddo, like 10 years ago. But, I want her and her friends and her grandkids, if she chooses to have them. I want our lakes to be there for them to enjoy. And I'm sure all of you do as well. Our programs, we do advocacy. Before this meeting tonight, I was on an advocacy meeting with a grassroots group of volunteers that were trained to be lake advocates for our lakes. We do conservation. If you know us at all, you may know us through our Lake Host Courtesy Boat Inspection Program. We meet and greet boaters at about 100 of the busiest ramps in the state, about 100,000 boaters per summer. And we teach boaters simple things they can do to keep invasive plants. So things like milfoil. If you've heard of invasive plant, you've heard of milfoil. And we help boaters take simple actions to prevent unwanted plants and animals from hitchhiking into or out of our lakes. And we now offer a Lake Smart, Lake Friendly Living program, and I'll get that a little bit more in detail. But we do outreach, and I'm really excited that this summer it looks like we may be able to go back out into public and just talk to real people about real lake things. And that's where we really get to meet folks that have an interest and just might not know about our lakes. But a few years ago, as a nonprofit organization, we asked our supporters and our partners, hey, how is New Hampshire Lakes doing? If we continue what we're doing, This was on our 25th birthday, actually. If we continue what we're doing, will our lakes be cleaner and healthier in 25 years from now? And the answer was no. We weren't surprised. People said, hey, our lakes are showing some serious signs of deterioration. More needs to be done to reduce nutrient pollution. So we talked about phosphorus. So more needs to be done to minimize the amount of phosphorus running into our lakes. More needs to be done to encourage a culture of lake-friendly living. So this became even more urgent last summer. Last summer was, we set a record in New Hampshire for the most public health advisories for toxic cyanobacteria blooms in our waters. And to be honest, we're a little concerned about that this summer as well. So generally relatively early ice out. And so fingers are crossed that we won't set a record this summer, but we're definitely keeping our eyes out on that. So, we heard, people said, hey, you're doing a good job, but more needs to be done in the state to reduce nutrient pollution and to encourage lake-friendly living. So in 2019, we kicked off a statewide program called the Lake Smart program. This is a program that's been going really well in Maine for 20 years. And they handed it over to us and we tweaked it for New Hampshire. And we've been running it sort of on a low level for the past couple of years, tweaking it to New Hampshire and working with local groups, including, AWA to some extent, to figure out how we can really bring this lakes friendly living program to communities throughout the state and people throughout the state. Here in this picture highlights we're working cooperatively with the Lake Winnipesaukee Association to deliver this program there. And these are some of our first Lake Smart, Lake Friendly winner, Lake Smart property owners. And you'll learn a little bit more about how this program works. Let's see. Hello. Okay. So Lake Smart is an education, evaluation, and recognition program that helps property owners basically take action to live in a lake-friendly way. It's free, it's voluntary, and non-regulatory. No one's going to get in trouble by participating in this program and telling the truth. So this program starts in your home. You take a 15-minute survey online, answering some questions about what you do in your home and how you manage your property in your shoreline if you live along the lake. And then you get an instant report. And it's basically a menu of opportunities that you have to live in an even more lake-friendly way. And at some point, if you think you're Lake Smart or you've done some projects become Lake Smart, you can invite a Lake Smart evaluator, someone from our Lake Smart team to come out and meet with you and walk your property. Let's see, going back here, and on that visit, our team will share, point out all the awesome things that you guys are, you're doing to keep the lake friendly and perhaps point out a few additional opportunities. Or they may right there on the spot you guys are doing a great job. You received the Lake Smart Award, and we'll see what that award looks like in a second here, right here. This is a family up on Silver Lake in Madison, Conway area. They were a really neat example of they bought this property that was pretty run down, had some, grass all the way to the shoreline, and they over time planted it, became master gardeners, planted pollinator gardens, did all this stuff to, increase the beneficial wildlife habitat, reduce the amount of lawn they had, all these things to make the property more healthy. But Lake Smart, this program helps keep our lakes clean and healthy, protects wildlife, protects your investment along the lake, and also helps support our local businesses and the economy. So through this program, you may find, we may recommend a variety of opportunities for you to, be even more lake friendly. And some of those, you may not be a DIY person. You may not want to do the projects yourself, or they may be like a little bit more complicated than planting a garden. They might be like, inspecting your septic system or maybe repairing it. So also through this program, we put participants in touch with Lake Smart service providers, so professionals who have been oriented and trained in what it means to do their work in a lake-friendly way. And the whole purpose of this program is really to create a norm of lake-friendly living. You know, we need early adopters, you know, people who are just willing to go through the program, become lake smart, hang that sign up, and, you know, hopefully encourage, you know, say John lived on a lake and he and his family becomes lake smart, and then maybe their neighbor sees the sign and says, hey, what did John do to become lake smart? I want to do that too. You know, sort of peer pressure. But once you have a critical mass of people in an area adopting a habit or a practice, it becomes a norm. And that's what they've found in Maine. And we're trying to recreate that success here in New Hampshire. So I just wanted, that was just a brief introduction to the program, but I just wanted to drill down to a few tips for you all to live in a lake-friendly way during spring. A lot of these tips also transcend other seasons. So keep this in mind. A lot of these are things you can do all year long when there's not snow and ice on the ground. But okay, so, you know, kind of a no-brainer, and I'm sure this is pretty obvious and funny. This is me at the start of the pandemic 2 years ago. And I was so excited when I saw the street sweeper go by my home. And the street sweeper went by this morning, and I was just as excited. But anyway, so a lake-friendly living tip is to sweep after the winter, you know, sweep your driveways and walkways to remove any leftover sand. We don't want this being washed into a lake. I don't live right next to a lake, but, you know, there's storm drains, and I know that those storm drains eventually go to the Pemigewasset River. So, you know, even if you live far away from a water body, what happens on your property will eventually impact the health of a water body. So sand in particular, we talked a little bit about soil already, can destroy fish spawning and nesting areas, clog fish gills, and what lots of people around lakes find offensive is it contributes to the lake bottom becoming mucky. And of course, it brings in nutrients. And as we talked about, we all know what nutrients do. So it's a best practice to sweep it up at the end of the year. And even though the street sweeper went by my house today, I do have some additional cleanup to do this weekend. This is a great time to get on your property and survey your property for areas where runoff water has washed soil away, especially during the next big rainstorm. You know, see where the water's going. Is it washing soil or gravel away? And, you know, try to figure out various ways, you know, different ways to stabilize that. And these are just a few examples of things you can do. This picture on the left is what's called a rubber razor. It's basically a conveyor belt sandwiched in between some timbers, sunk into the ground, and having crushed stone on either side. It's basically, its purpose is to divert water off that driveway and into a vegetated area. On our website, and you'll get the link, and I know John also has this on his website, we have sort of some fact sheets on how you can do these things yourself. This middle picture is a set of infiltration steps. So it's stairs leading down to the water body, but this crushed stone, you know, helps to soak up rain and runoff water so that, you know, the path isn't funneling soil and runoff water into the lake. And the picture on the right is just an example of a healthy, diverse vegetated buffer along the shoreline to help the shoreline stay stable and provide wildlife habitat, prevent erosion, that sort of thing. So yeah, I encourage you the next rainstorm, just to, you know, put on your raincoat, your umbrella, get your camera, and just walk around the property and find areas where, you know, look for areas where erosion is happening, where runoff water is happening, and then go back inside, go to our website, go to AWA's website, and figure out, you know, how you can address those issues. And if you need help, call one of us. It's also a great time, you know, once the snow has left, to inspect the area of your septic system, if you have one. I will tell you, these three pictures are all examples of things you do not want to see, and things that would probably say, I should call an expert right away. Ponded water, or areas, the middle picture is kind of crazy, but it's, you know, if you have really unnaturally bright green areas in your septic, your leach field, that means that there's, you know, high amount of nutrients there, and the grass there is going crazy. But why is there a high amount of nutrients there? Because your septic system isn't properly digesting those nutrients. And of course, any sort of the picture on the right, this is, a caving in septic tank. And so that's going to result in malfunction. So if you have any concerns, you see anything that even gets close to these pictures, or if it's just been a while since you've had your system looked at, or pumped, reach out to a certified professional. That is one of the key ways to be lake friendly, is to understand your septic system, and then have a maintenance plan that's appropriate for it. Your maintenance plan is going to be dependent upon the size and the age and the type of system you have and how often it's used and all of that. All right, what else? Seems like a no-brainer, but clean up the pet waste in your yard. It's been a long winter. I was like, we have to do that this weekend. I think my 13-year-old will be doing that this weekend. Pet waste can contain harmful bacteria, and that we don't want that to wash into our lakes. I know it's tempting, but refrain from fertilizing your lawn. Fertilizer washed into the lake, just like it makes plants grow, your grass grow, makes plants, algae, and cyanobacteria grow in the lake. Generally speaking, our soils in New Hampshire really don't need fertilizer. But if you're not sure, you can go to the store and buy a quick soil test kit, or you can, I don't have the information here, but you can get your soil tested by the UNH Cooperative Extension. If you feel that you really, really must use fertilizer, know that there are some there's a law, the Shoreline Protection Act says, there's a setback from the water, and you'll want to use low phosphorus or phosphorus-free fertilizer. And this picture here on the right just shows when you go to the store to look for your fertilizer, it'll be that the three number ratio. You want the number in the middle to be 0. All right, what else? And another thing you can do while you're getting ready for fishing, and I had my mom do this a couple of years ago. More than a couple of years ago. This is my mom and my daughter. We went and looked through Grandma's tackle box. For those, and we looked to remove lead, any sort of fishing tackle that had lead in it. So you may be familiar that lead is the leading cause of death for our loons in New Hampshire. So loons inadvertently consuming lead fishing tackle. And I want to do a shout out to our partners at the Loon Preservation Committee. The past couple of years, they have done an amazing job of getting programs in place for anglers to turn in their lead tackle and get a voucher to buy new tackle that's lead free. So take a look at your tackle box. If you have anything that's older than 10 years, generally speaking, you can assume that has some sort of lead in it. And I encourage you to use gloves when you do this, but if you take a sinker or a piece of tackle and run it down a piece of paper and it leaves like a little gray mark, that means you have lead. So good thing to do. And we just talked about that. And on our website, nhlakes.org LakeSmart, we've got a resource library of different resources to help you with these projects. Also a link to find LakeSmart service providers. And I know AWA has information on their website as well in this area. So if you haven't started LakeSmart, I encourage you to do that. Again, it's a free 15-minute online survey. And if you just go that far, you're going to get a PDF with lake-friendly living opportunities, and then you may want to actually do some of them and eventually invite one of us out and hopefully become officially a recipient of the award. So in closing, I think it really will take all of us working together to keep our lakes clean and healthy. And I'm so thankful for partners like AWA and all the work that you do in your region of the state. It's a big job, and we, all need to pitch in. If our kids and our grandkids and our family in the future are going to enjoy, what we're enjoying today. So, on that note, that's all I had tonight. I'm happy to answer questions. John, if you'll have this recording, I can also share the PDF of the slides with you.
Yep, that'd be great.
But
we did have one question in the chat, Andrea. I don't know if you saw that.
Okay.
If you want to address Steve's question, he was asking how can lake watershed associations adopt the Lake Smart program?
Sure, sure. Thanks for the question, Steve. In general, this program is, we're looking for local partners to work with. And I said we are actively working with the Lake Winnipesaukee Association. I know we've been in conversation with AWA and John about how we might, I know AWA already has a really great program, and how might we sort of add a little bit of Lake Smart to it. So that's a conversation we'll be continuing with John about the awesome work that AWA already does. But generally, if a lake association is interested in, first of all, property owners can reach out to New Hampshire Lakes, and our New Hampshire Lakes Lake Smart team can work with you one-on-one. But what we really hope is that local lake associations will say, we want to be a host organization. Property owners are going to learn best from their friends and neighbors. So we are we have a training program for local groups, and we would love to work with a few more groups this coming summer to train them to deliver this program in their community. So I would say, Steve, if you have interest in that, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll put you in touch with Crystal, our conservation program manager, and she can talk to you about how we can set that relationship up. So great question.
Sarah she was asking if New Hampshire Lakes has any documentation or resources on septic systems near lakes, which I know is probably unlikely, but maybe perhaps do you know where those resources exist, if they exist in the state, and how to access specific town regulations on this kind of stuff?
That is a great question, Sarah. And I would say my high elevation response to you is, first of all, New Hampshire is not doing a very good job with septic systems in general. And that is the reason why in the legislature 2 years ago, a septic study commission was formed to study, the threat of septic systems to our water quality, and then what we could do to address that through state regulations and town regulations. And I'm sorry to report that septic study committee didn't produce a lot of useful actions. But we're not giving up. But I would say at this point, there aren't a lot for individuals. There aren't a lot of opportunities for cost sharing, although there are some awesome organizations like AWA that do offer residents some sort of cost sharing to inspect and upgrade systems. So it's really sort of there's not a lot happening there right now. And I know that New Hampshire Lakes should be taking that septics issue more serious. No, not that we're not taking it seriously, but we need to try to move the needle on that. Again, New Hampshire is just behind the 8 ball when it comes to innovative technologies and also regulations that are protective, and also incentives to help people upgrade systems. That's a really great question. Thanks for answering that. I wish I had a more upbeat answer for you.
And I'll just quickly follow up and say, so we have our septic cost share program, but if a lake has a watershed management plan, then you can apply for federal 319 grant funding, the Clean Water Act, and those are the funds that AWA applies for, that they allow us to use some of that funding as cost share. So we get the 319 grant for a lake, and then we'll say we have funding for 5 septic system cost shares, or 8 for that lake, or for a group of lakes, and that's how we're able to do that program. So it's not super common in the state, but in theory, any lake that has a watershed management plan and applies for 319 funding can do it.
Absolutely.
Yep. But yeah, like you said, Andrea, that's there's a lot to be desired for how New Hampshire handles its septic systems and keeping track of that.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, that was the last question I saw in the chat.
Awesome.
So if you have any final, wrap up comments or anything, then feel free to go for it. But thank you so much for all the information you provided this evening.
Yeah, well, I just, again, thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all for bearing with me as I dusted off my lake physics. I was a little rusty there, but hopefully I got to it. And again, I'll make these slides available to John. And for any of you in the audience, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or want to learn more about Lake Smart or just talk about lakes in general. I'm a self-professed lake nerd and I love talking people's ears off about them. So thanks for this opportunity, John. It was nice to see you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yep, I think, the folks that stuck around for the whole thing definitely appreciated it. So it's a really fascinating topic to me. So I'm really glad that you were able to speak on it.
Cool. All right. Well,
So, well, have a great night.
yep. Happy spring.
Yeah,
Good
you
night.
too. Thanks.